and then lots of high-profile studies on gender equality as part of our Global Institute for Women's Leadership. Really great studies there too. So on tonight's event, it's excellent to have two key Ipsos experts with us on how the elections will play out in both the UK and the US, and then a brilliant panel to discuss not just the elections themselves, but the implications for US-UK relations and geopolitics more generally. So first, we'll have a presentation from Cliff Young on what the polls are telling us in the US. Cliff is president of Ipsos Public Affairs in the US, and also leads the global election and political polling practice. Cliff focuses on social and public opinion trends, crisis management, corporate reputation, as well as election polling, and has polled over 100 elections around the world. He still looks so young on it, but he's incredible reach from Cliff. Then we'll hear from Kelly Beaver, MBE, focusing on the UK picture. So Kelly is the chief executive of Ipsos in the UK. And as well as leading the UK business, Kelly has overseen some of Ipsos' biggest research programs, including the REACT study tracking COVID-19 prevalence across England, through to key pieces of work with the Royal Foundation on the importance of early years. Prior to joining Ipsos, Kelly held roles across various consultants, including PwC, KPMG, and among many other roles is a visiting senior research fellow at the Policy Institute. So following the presentations, which we'll have from the stage, we'll be joined on the stage by Lord George Robertson and Miranda Green to offer their reflections. So Lord Robertson is a Labour Party politician who served as the 10th Secretary General of NATO from 1999 to 2004. He was Secretary of State for Defence from 1997 to 1999 before becoming a life peer. George first entered the House of Commons as a Labour MP for Hamilton, which is where I was born, which is incredible. George represented us, and then won 5 subsequent general elections. He served as chairman of the Labour Party in Scotland and was appointed to the Privy Council. And George has received numerous honours, including 12 honorary doctorates from various universities, and has been a really brilliant visiting professor here at the Policy Institute too. Thank you, George. And then we'll have Miranda Green, who has served as a UK and World News editor at the Financial Times and has been the paper's education and political correspondent. She also helped found The Day to assist schools teaching current affairs to teenagers, and worked for the Liberal Democrat Party in the House of Commons from 1995 to 2000. And Miranda's been named Culture Diary and Social Commentator of the Year in the Comment Awards. So we're going to take presentations first from Cliff, then from Kelly, then we'll have a panel discussion from George and Miranda, then we'll have plenty of time for questions from you, and we'll wrap up by 7:30 for some drinks and hopefully lovely sunshine on the terrace. So Cliff, welcome, Cliff Young.
Bobby, it all has to do with how you do the math. That's how I got to 100. I had to get to 100, yeah. First and foremost, thank you, Bobby. Thank you, Kings. It's great to be here. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Ipsos, for being here and inviting me. I've been on a European tour, and this is the last leg. Hopefully, it is the most amazing leg, or bit, as you say, ultimately. I have 2 broad points I want to make. Just 2. First, I don't know what's going to happen. I truly do not know what is going to happen. We do not know what's going to happen. And if anyone tells you that they know what's going to happen, they're full of it. Cliff Young said that, right? And why is that the case? First and foremost, and I'll show you this in the data. By the way, you don't have to believe me. You don't have to take me on sort of my word. You can look at the data with me. I'll walk you through it. But the signals are mixed. The signals are mixed against a backdrop of a macroeconomic scenario that's changing. The Biden administration hopes for the best, right? Ultimately, they're hoping for a better scenario to lift their numbers, which are waning at this point. That's the first point. We don't know what's going to happen, and I'll show you why, and I'll show you what to look for when tracking the election looking forward. The second point is that America is a broken country today. It's one where a majority of Americans believe that the system is broken, that parties and politicians no longer care about the average person, that the system is rigged by the elite against the common man and the common woman, and that there needs to be a strong leader to take the country back. This is a very populist, anti-system, anti-establishment orientation. This is something we see around the world, not just in the United States. Its manifestation is manifold, different flavors, different forms in different places. But in the United States, it takes on the form of the establishment in Biden, the establishment, which means order, stability, regular rules of order, and the anti-establishment in Trump, which means a broken system, a belief that the country that once was no longer is, and perhaps won't be. Again, the establishment against the anti-establishment. I'm going to show you data on these 2 points. I'm going to start with context. I'm going to start with the broader frame. We're going to look at the system or the anti-system at this point. And I want to show you this data. Did it work? Almost. Lots of slides. There we go. Cool data here. This reinforces the belief, our point about the belief that the system is broken. This is one item. Basically, we need a strong leader to take the country back, even if he or she breaks the rules. And breaking the rules is important in this one. Even though Trump breaks the rules, we have countries rank ordered. Look at the UK. It's going to be a very traditional election, but I think there's problems, I would say, under the surface. But I'm not an expert. What we do see is the Democratic Party and the Republican Party compared against other countries. The Republican is very much an anti-system party today. This is not the party of Ronald Reagan. This is the party of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is their champion, a champion that's channeling these grievances. Look at blue, look at the Democrats. Once again, it's the party of order, of the establishment. This is an election between the establishment and the anti-establishment. The second point is, what is going on? Why do so many people believe the system is broken? I make the argument here and nowhere else. I'm not going to show you other data, but this is not an economic issue. This is almost purely a cultural one. We have an America today that is not like America yesterday. It's an America that's more diverse, less white, more immigrants. 15% of Americans, individuals living in the United States, are foreign-born. By the way, 15% is the same number for Europe as well. Keep that in mind, right? But this ultimately is a reaction, that is Trump and his movement is a reaction to this change. And this data that I'm showing you is a very simple data point over time, looking at sort of treatment of immigrants. Could you place more weight on foreign-born or native-born? And we see, what do we see over time? That America is becoming less nativist, more progressive, more tolerant. By the way, we see this across all indicators, not just nativism here, not just this indicator. But what do we also see? Republicans are standing still. They are equally or uniformly nativist over time. See that difference? It's a huge difference between Republicans and Democrats. This is our politics today. This is how Trump is organizing himself and his movement by channeling the grievance of those that feel the country has slipped through their fingers. That's the context. Very happy context, right? Optimism, ultimately. So what I'm going to do now is share 3 bits of information. This is how I analyze elections. This is how we analyze elections at Ipsos, I'll say more specifically, at Ipsos in the US. And I want you to sort of kind of come away, positive or negative, whether someone has a better chance of winning versus another, that is Trump versus Biden. The first I call the 85% rule. This is based upon a big, huge data, by the way, I'm being a nerd now, big, huge data set. And what we know is that the candidate that's strongest on the main issue, the issue that's most important, at that moment in time, has a high degree of likelihood of winning the next election. The classic example is 2020, COVID. Trump was weak on COVID, Biden was strong on COVID, Biden won. Great example. And so what we want to do initially is look at the evidence relative to the main issue. What is the main issue? It's a little bit confused. Okay? So how should you read this chart? Remember, red is Republican, blue is Democrat, gray is basically independents. Independents are like the average. So if you want to have a notion about the general population, look at the independents. We have political extremism in number 1, in first place. We have the economy in number 2, second place. And we have immigration number 3 in third place. It's confused. I would not, based upon my experience with these indicators, say that one has an advantage over the other. What we see both here in the red and the blue, as well in the next slide, is that threats to democracy, political extremism, is a Democratic issue. It's a Biden issue. This is the issue that Biden and his campaign want. They want to own this issue if it's a number 1 issue, because they're strong on this issue. By the way, threat to democracy, who's a threat to democracy? In their mind, Trump. Okay? In contrast, Trump is strong on immigration. He ran on that in 2016, won. He uses it to mobilize his base. I showed those nativist sort of data points. He uses that to organize, and he channels his base's grievance. And lastly, and most importantly in my mind, the economy, more specifically inflation. That typically is a Republican issue, and that's a Trump issue today. And I'll just reinforce that data point very quickly. This is matchup between the two. Look at number 1, political extremism. Who wins on that? Biden. On the economy and immigration, who wins on those two? Trump. What happens when this scenario, when it comes to main issues, is fuzzy? We don't know what's going to happen. It's difficult to say. Right? It's difficult to say what will happen, especially as a macroeconomic scenario changes, potentially improving. We would expect these rank orderings to change. But for today, it's fuzzy. You have 3 primary issues. 2 go to Trump, and 2 go to Biden. Excuse me, 1. So, on the main issue, it's kind of a toss-up. That's my take, at least. The other thing we have is called a 40% rule. Us Americans, we like to brand things, right? So basically, the 40% rule is a sitting president with 40% approval rating has better than a 50-50 chance of winning the next election. This is based upon a large data set that we have as well. And the question is, what's going on? Well, I'm going to round up. And I'm just going to say it's 40. Right? We're at 40. It's kind of 50-50. Biden's not in a great place. He's not in a terrible place. But once again, he's not in an awesome place either. Right? Okay? I just want to share this data point because I think it's cool. This is the amalgamation of the data set of those multiple elections, hundreds of elections around the world. The first column is basically the approval rating of the government. The second column is basically the likelihood of an incumbent winning. And the third column is the likelihood of a successor winning. An incumbent has a much greater chance of winning than its successor. I'll come back to that. At 40% approval rating, Biden would have a 55% chance of winning. We see that. And if Biden didn't run, which was the argument of many in the Democratic Party, the successor, his successor, would have a 6% chance of winning. By the way, if it's 6, if it's 10, it's 12, I mean, it's not very good, right? I think that's the point. We consistently made this argument that the Democrats' best chance of winning was actually Biden running, okay? Is it 50-50? A little bit towards Biden. I want to make one point about why he's sagging in the polls, and that's basically, you know, look at these constituency groups. This is like looking at declines over time. Look at the red. We're looking at declines in approval ratings over time. We find that Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, less affluent Americans, and younger Americans all have lower approval ratings than you would otherwise expect. By the way, these are the key constituencies of the Democratic Party. This is why Biden is having an issue today. This is why he has such sagging numbers, in my opinion. This is an ugly table. I made this table. Everything else was done by the great team here at Ipsos UK. This is my table, but I like this table. And look at the blue. Blue, 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 blue. Everything's the economy. Those are all Biden's, or the Democrats' key constituency groups. They all are worried about the economy, more specifically inflation. Let me say something about inflation, about what we know, and what we know about how people think about it. It's not about rates. No one understands it at all. I don't even understand it, really. They're worried about price levels. If you were paying $500 a year ago for your basic foodstuffs and household goods, and you're paying $600 today, you don't care what the rate is. You know you're paying $100 more, and that $100 does not fit in your budget, right? You don't have disposable income, and this is really an issue of wages outstripping price levels. That's a macroeconomic thing. That's not a Biden thing. Biden has tried over and over and over again to convince these people, convince these constituency groups that he's doing a good job. But if I'm paying $100 more than I was a year before, you are not doing a good job. In my mind, that's one of the big errors of the Democratic Party and the Biden campaign today. They don't understand that. Can't force something that people don't want. It's pretty basic. And lastly, oh my gosh, so I'm a pollster. Full disclosure, I am a pollster. And I'm only talking about polls at the end. Or horse race polls at the end. Why is that? Because I don't really trust them right now. Now, I trust them somewhat, but not enough to make a very precise and accurate prediction. Now, look up here. This is basically the average error rate stamped by time, right? And at 6 months, the average error rate is about 6%. That's pretty big. I don't feel comfortable with the polls today. I might use them nominally, directionally, but I have worries about them, right? They're fuzzy at best. And they should be fuzzy for everyone. We should all be careful. And lastly, take a look here. We do not have a national election. We have 50 state elections. Only 6 states matter. In those 6 states, about 150,000 to 200,000 people matter. That's it. Everyone else can go home, right? Like basically, you know, I often say that someone's complaining about something and they live like in California, or New York, or Texas, I go move. Because that's the only way, basically, you're gonna have an impact. But what's the point here in the 6 swing states? They're all red. What's red? Being Republican. All the polls in all 6 of these swing states are Republican today. Will they be Republican tomorrow? I think things will tighten up, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. But today, they're all red. So I guess that, you know, I guess the polls go to Trump. And by the way, the polls dominate the narrative when we assess ultimately any sort of scenario. Okay. Oh. Yeah, this is awesome. So let me say, I'm done, but I need to get a couple words out. So basically, both Trump and Biden have a significant non-zero chance of winning. There, I gave you actually a response, right? We should not underestimate Trump. I think the most important point here is that he does represent a large swath of the American population that feels left behind. It's a legitimate concern. It's a legitimate feeling. In addition, price levels are tricky at best. And ultimately, the Biden campaign can't just go and peddle the same things they've been peddling because people are really feeling the pinch. Okay? So this is the Ipsos UK conclusion. I think it's awesome, though. I mean, I think it's awesome. First and foremost, America is positively predisposed to populist and anti-system sort of messages and policies, orientations, and candidates. We saw that with the data. Not the entire population, not all of America, but still a significant portion. The election is 50-50 in my mind. Is it a little bit Trump or a little bit Biden? It really depends on the assumptions you make, right? The economy will be key in my mind, and more specifically, to what extent does the inertial inflation sort of wash itself out? We should be looking at the main problems, especially in the key swing states. Right now, there's an absolute tie in the key swing states between the economy and threats to democracy. And last but not least, the horse race polls obviously matter. They'll take on much more robustness after the conventions in July. That's when I will begin to watch them. And with that, thank you.
So the US election is a cliffhanger. I wish, well, I don't wish, but I'm definitely not going to be saying that about the UK election. So, but before I start, I thought what I would do with my time is also to tell you a little bit about the special relationship. I'm going to talk mostly about public attitudes in the UK, opinion, and the run-in to the election at potentially the end of this year, most likely the end of this year. But first, does the special relationship still exist? We've done some polling for our good friends here in the audience, but also, what do we think of each other? What do the US population think of the UK and Brits? And what do the Brits think of the Americans? Well, we ask about best and worst characteristics, and for British people, we think that Americans are largely patriotic, confident and friendly, and they think that we are polite and good-mannered, that we have nice accents, and I'll let you determine which accents they're talking about, and then also friendly. On worst characteristics, there's some interesting points here. The Brits think the Americans are ignorant of other cultures, loud and arrogant, and when we flip it and we ask in reverse what they think of us British people, they mostly don't have a really strong sense of feeling about worst characteristics, but on those they do call out. We are arrogant, we're intolerant of other cultures, and that we have bad teeth. And Cliff confirms this is an actual stereotyped issue. Now, the special relationship, this is something that we asked about, whether Britons and Americans think there's a special relationship between the two sides, and around half tell us that they believe that there is. And this is something that we've seen over the last 8 years, thereabouts. Only 1 in 5, though, of our British population believe that actually there isn't really a special relationship, and perhaps that's because the Brits are worrying about it a bit more than their American colleagues. Depending on who leads after the next American election, do people believe that that means that things will become more positive in that special relationship, or actually that it will be more challenging? And you can see that a Trump lead, the population in the UK largely think that would make things more challenging, a more negative outcome around the special relationship. But actually, on either candidate, there's not a real sense that there will be more positive momentum in that relationship as a result of either being elected. And then lastly, so you've heard from Cliff, he's done 100 elections, his whole job is about understanding what's happening in America. So I thought we'd ask the British public who they thought was most likely to win. And they are really not sure. They're not sure. Just over a quarter say Joe Biden, 3 in 10 say Donald Trump, 3 in 10 say they don't know, and 1 in 7 say that they think neither, and it will be somebody completely different. So either they know something that we don't know about the health or the prison term of some of our candidates. But now back to the UK. And as Cliff said, horse race polls at this point, you really should be looking much more broadly at the mood of the nation, what people think and feel about the key policies, about the leaders, and even the parties themselves. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about those, and then also touch on the horse race poll, because we have that data and it's worth looking at a little bit. But the mood of the British populace, Cliff said his was not very optimistic. I think here in the UK, we also have a very sombre mood amongst the UK nation. This is a piece we do to track whether people perceive the country is going in the right or the wrong direction. And we have 6 in 10 consistently since a brief Truss interlude back in the autumn of 2022 who say it is going in the wrong direction. And this also, if you counter it with some of the data we have on how they perceive government to be performing, gives you an indication of how they feel about the nation and our ability to govern it. But it's not all doom and gloom, and you might think it is from looking at the red lines on this chart. This is our economic optimism indicator, where we ask the public whether they think every month the economic condition of the country is getting worse, it's getting better in the next 12 months, worse in the next 12 months, or it's going to stay the same. Now, we're a nation of pessimists when it comes to the economy, so expect below the line. That is mostly where we live. However, if you look at the key moments here, so the Truss term in autumn where we saw a significant drop-off in economic optimism, similar and akin to what we saw during the financial crisis in 2008. But at the beginning of this year, we've now moved from -28 to the current score, which came out today, of -4. That's quite a substantive improvement in our sort of less pessimistic outlook on the economy, if you will. So some of the undercurrent indicators, they are starting to move a little, but that doesn't mean we can forget the overall sentiment. And the sentiment in this country is that it is time for a change at the next election. 3 in 4 say that that is what they would like to see, only 1 in 5 saying it is not time for a change. And the sentiment where people want change is on the rise. So I will show you a horse race poll, because I must. It's one of our key voting intention polls, and you can see today we published the most recent voting intention from Ipsos in the UK, and we have Labour with a 21-point lead. Now, that is softer than the lead that they had last month when we polled, but ultimately still a sizable lead nonetheless. And where are their votes going in the last month? Well, they haven't gone to Labour, or sorry, Labour's votes haven't gone to the Conservative Party. They're going to some of the smaller parties like the Lib Dems and the Greens. So, the issues that are at play. We've had a very long running, now this is the 50th year of the Ipsos Issues Index, where we go out to the public and we ask them spontaneously, without preempting, what are the big issues that you think are facing the country today? And they tell us, and we code them. This is the 50th year of this index. And we're looking now at what the top 4 issues, and they have been quite consistent in slightly different orders over the last year. And they are the economy, the NHS, cost of living, and immigration. Those are the top 4. Public tell us that the one that might determine their vote most is the NHS. But look at how the government is performing on each of those issues as per the public's views. 7 in 10 say bad job on the economy, 8 in 10 bad job on the NHS, over 3/4 bad job on cost of living, and 8 in 10 on immigration. Those are not great scores on the doors. But how would they find a Labour lead on these? How would they feel about a Labour Party and the policies they've got? And we asked them, who do they think has the best policies? It's not that cut and dry. On NHS and cost of living it is. It's a sizable Labour lead. On the economy, the lead is small. And on immigration, whilst Labour lead marginally, it's very, very marginal. And actually, this is an issue that really matters to 2019 Conservative voters, and you can see why it's being played out so much in the party conversations at this time. So on the leaders then, we have two leaders in the UK, neither for either party is pulling out fantastic net satisfaction ratings. Rishi Sunak wins, however, and that's not a prize you want to win, of being -55, which is similar to what we've seen at the worst levels for Jeremy Corbyn and John Major. So why is he polling so badly? A show of hands, different answers. No, I don't need to do that. The answer is it's not just because he's perceived as being out of touch with ordinary people. We've had lots of figures elected when they're considered to be out of touch with ordinary people. In fact, Blair was considered out of touch, as was Thatcher. The issue for him is that that is also compounded by a belief that he and his government are not competent. He's not perceived as capable in a leadership role, and the government's track record is playing against him too. But then we have Keir Starmer. Now I saw this on Twitter and I absolutely loved it, thought it was funny, but I thought I would use it today. So Keir Starmer's net satisfaction ratings are nowhere near as bad as Sunak's. He's sitting at -18 as of our most recent poll in May. But he's in a very different place than when Blair took leadership in 1997, who was sitting at +22. And so this, by Matthew Holehouse of The Economist, just epitomises some of the things that we're seeing at the minute from the Labour Party. It is Blair, but it is slightly sadder and slightly more professional looking as well. But these first steps that have come out from the Labour leader are partly a means of communicating a bit more about what he's about and what Labour stand for. And that's absolutely critical, because we see in the polling that we do and in the research through focus groups that we do, people still, around 50%, are telling us they don't really know what he or indeed Labour stand for. So there's work to be done, and the first steps will form the first part of that. And then lastly, on the parties themselves. So the Conservative Party brand, I remember talking at the various different fringe events at conferences over the last couple of years, and this has been a slide that we have shown, and it just keeps telling the same sort of story, I'm afraid. So we have seen a significant decline in some of the key metrics that we use to measure how people feel about the party brand for the Conservatives. This on fitness to govern, only 15% now believe they're fit to govern, 12% a good team of leaders. And that has been moving substantively downwards over the last two elections. But look at Labour. Is Labour much better than they were before? Actually, what we're seeing from Labour is steady. Steady as she goes. 38%, 26, 28, 29, 35, etc. And so Labour is comparatively doing okay by way of party comparison, and it's more a story of the Conservative Party image decline. So what might happen? So what Cliff didn't cover is he had 3 scenarios on a slide, and not to be outdone, I created 3 scenarios, but only 2 of them are viable, so bear with me. But I wanted 3, so guess which one is less likely to be a reality. So 3 possible things that could happen between now and the point of an election. Scenario 1, Conservative comeback, akin to 1992, drop an unpopular leader, Thatcher to Major, and then an unpopular policy, poll tax equivalent, come back and win. Should have called it something more exciting from Sunak's perspective. But actually, what you can see here is that in that election, they were already on an upward trajectory, way ahead of where the Conservatives are today, which would make it very improbable and really too late. The second scenario is Starmer's dream. So 1997, there's minimal recovery from the economic crisis, which helps to lead towards a landslide. And in many ways, there are parts of the polling that do speak to this story, the sizable voting intention lead that you can see, the collapse of the Conservative Party brand, but the leadership scores are not what Blair was getting back in that landslide. In fact, they are far from it. So perhaps my third scenario, somewhere between number 2 and 3, might be a reality. Number 3, Sunak crosses his fingers, and a la 2010, with an economic crisis which was ensuing then, the government still loses, but actually recovers enough just to deny a majority. And somewhere between 2 and 3 may be where we end up. Thank you very much.
Join us. Come on up, Cliff.
Where do you want to go?
I'll go in.
Okay.
Very good, whatever you like. Come on up, George. Have a seat. Absolutely brilliant. Excellent run through from both Cliff and Kelly there. Now we're going to hear from George and Miranda, just 5-6 minutes comments from each of those before we come to you for questions. So do start thinking about what questions you want to put to the panel. But perhaps maybe if I come to you first, George, for your reflections.
Well, like Cliff, I don't know what the hell's going to happen. And, you know, we're faced with first past the post in this country. And just like the American system, it's not really about the whole of the country. It's about a few states, and it's actually a few people in the states. In this country, it can be very complicated as well. The Labour Party's on something close to 40% at the moment, but that's not even half the electorate. I was the leader of the Scottish Labour Party in 1997, and we got 45.6% of the vote. The highest Labour has ever got in Scotland, contrary to popular imagination. And we got 80% of the seats. In 2019, last election, the SNP got 45% of the vote, so that's less than we got in 97, and got 80% of the seats. So there's a very random nature about the vote in this country. And therefore, I think that Keir Starmer and his team are quite right to be cautious, really cautious at the moment, because you can't take anything for granted. And we're all haunted by 1992 and the belief at that time that we were going to win. When the Financial Times, Miranda's here representing the Financial Times today, came out that morning of the polling day and said, vote Labour. And we thought, that's it, you know, the cherry on the cake. And we lost. So I think they're absolutely right, you know, to be truly conscious, whatever the pollsters say and whatever the opinion polls say, and however unpopular the government looks at the present moment. It may be on Wednesday, this Wednesday, Rishi Sunak might announce the election. That's probably the last possible date for doing it, and there are people who are predicting that he might well do it. People who seem to know about it, but more likely it's going to be the autumn, and there's going to be a substantial period in between. And in the meantime, one hopes that preparations are going on. I'm not in the leadership team. You know, I'm one of those people like David Cameron, you know, people who go around saying, do you know who I used to be? And they don't all get rescued like David Cameron to do with that. But I think therefore caution, although it's boring and it's you know, unexciting and it's sort of what do they stand for, the reality is that you can't take the electorate for granted. And you're quite right to sort of put that forward. So what will happen if the American election produces various results? If Joe Biden wins, it'll probably be narrowly. Not much will change. But actually, Joe Biden's foreign policy is actually pretty conservative anyway. Highly protectionist, as it stands at the present moment. Obsessed with immigration, although not as much as Donald Trump is. But things would go on with people that we basically know. If Donald Trump wins, and that's a preoccupation, you know, of so many people now, what if, and that cloud hangs over all of us in terms of military, strategic, and everything. You know, what on earth is going to happen? And we may, you know, get ourselves into the condition where we deliver what we fear. But, you know, I was at a conference last week where an American said a cascade of instability is the likelihood. We will not know what his policy is going to be, except that it is going to be worse than the last time round. Because he knows where the levers are that he can pull. There's a degree of vengeance now built into the system. And if you believe, as I do believe, that we are at a hinge moment, basically in events in the world because of Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, then the implications of that instability and that lack of coherence should be really deeply worrying for all of us. If Donald Trump is to pull out of supporting Ukraine and allowing Vladimir Putin to take what he's already got or even more, then the world is going to be a very different place. And the rules of order and the kind of order that we have grown used to over the years will dramatically shift. And the rules will be written by our enemies, by Russia, China, North Korea and Iran. They will undoubtedly be the people who will be dominant in the world. And therefore we are right to be worried about what might happen if he was to come. Yeah. But we have to live with the consequences. You know, American democracy is American democracy. They have the right to choose whoever it is they want. Difficult to understand for us over here how 230 million people can be boiled down to Joe Biden and Donald Trump. But then we gave a majority of 80 to Boris Johnson. So we're not actually in a very good position to make judgments about other people's choices as well. But the world is, as I say, on a hinge very much at the moment. I believe very, very substantially in the fact that if Vladimir Putin gets away with it, then our world is transformed. And therefore the worry is that Donald Trump, once he is free from that courthouse in New York, may well be developing a foreign policy that's going to have profound implications for all of us.
Thank you, George. That was brilliant insight and really lays out the fears and risks that we've got ahead of us. Miranda, do you have a cheerier take or a similar place?
Okay, I'll reach for a cheerier take. How's that? George has quite rightly apologised for us sort of offering the world Boris Johnson, I think. But I can't help looking at the UK election to come this year, whenever it comes, and to think we've made some progress since the last one, since the voters will now be offered Rishi Sunak versus Keir Starmer, and not Boris Johnson versus Jeremy Corbyn. So there are small things to celebrate, I would say, in that choice, and possibly it's a slightly happier one than America's facing, actually. So there we are, that's my chink of light, Bobby. In terms of the presentations, thank you both so much. It's completely fascinating, and obviously we can only just sort of skim the surface as a response, but I'm very interested in this idea of instability in a dangerous world, partly because that started to creep into the UK election pitches in the last few days. Undoubtedly, the backdrop of the UK election is the US election. And for both Rishi Sunak and David Cameron to start to talk about, it's a dangerous world out there, it's insecure, it's unpredictable even, as Cliff said, and to try and use that as an argument to, you know, stick with the devil you know, stick with the Conservative government, I find that very interesting, particularly because the Labour pitch is so much about economic security already. I mean, Rachel Reeves has even branded her pitch to run the Treasury Securonomics on the basis that, you know, people are hurting, but it is an unpredictable world. If we have a rise in protectionism from the states, trade wars, if we have Trump back, you know, that somehow Labour can protect the British public from economic headwinds as well as security headwinds. And actually, I thought it was really notable in Keir Starmer's speech to the Labour Party conference in the autumn, where he talked about shelter from the storm. So I'm going to be really interested actually to see whether that develops as a theme as our election gets closer, this idea of a dangerous world. And, you know, Cliff's point on the economy, on, you know, talking about inflation rates is irrelevant to people staring at a bunch of much, much higher prices than they were a year, 2 years ago. I think that's something possibly that in our British conversation we're missing at the moment, and the government certainly seems to be putting all its eggs in the argument that inflation will come down, people will think the economy here is turning a corner, and therefore that's a reason to vote Conservative. I just wonder about that, and actually looking at Kelly's sort of projections there, I love that graph about economic pessimism.
How miserable we are.
How miserable we are, but then then we've just gone up to -4, which is quite a change.
It is, but let's just see if it continues as a trend, because there was some, I think, positive economic news in the most recent period, so let's see if it continues for a longer time. But yeah, but generally, when you look back at this, gradually been slightly less pessimistic.
So that really interests me, because also I wonder whether we can actually take that as an automatic sort of point of encouragement for Conservative strategists, because actually if you've got that strength of appetite in terms of time for a change among the British electorate, if you also have an economy slightly turning the corner and time for a change, and your worry is about whether the Labour Party is going to have any money to spend on the collapsing public services in the NHS, that actually slightly becomes, you know, an argument not for better the devil you know, but also but for a change of government that might do something and spend some money. So, you know, I think that's very, very interesting to look at. One thing I was interested in sort of asking my colleagues on the panel was whether they thought that there was a, you know, any sort of interplay between the parallel elections. I mean, I would hesitate to suggest to Cliff that anyone in America is particularly going to notice what's going on here, but I wonder on the impact on us across the Atlantic. You know, earlier, a few months ago, I got Ben Ansell of Oxford University to do us a sort of piece about whether there would be an impact on security fears around the UK election. I don't know what George thinks about that. You know, cyber security, the potential perhaps for bad actors to contaminate both elections with online fakes, all sorts of things which might, you know, start a sort of cycle of greater polarisation. Does that then feed into a bit of polarisation here? Bobby, I know you do so much work on cultural stuff. I wonder what you thought about that. And also, I just wanted to raise the topic of policy, because a change of government in America obviously will change so much about US policy, not just on you know, geopolitics in terms of security, but also, you know, trade. You know, there's been such an emphasis in the Biden administration on the green transition and infrastructure projects that again, Labour has tried to sort of piggyback on as a sort of intellectual justification for green transition stuff here. Does that all, you know, how does that look if we're sort of going it alone in the UK on green transition without that Biden example? You know, so those are my immediate thoughts. But I mean, fantastic! Thank you so much for all that data. There's days of investigation to do there.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm going to come back, let Kelly and Cliff come back to either the comments set from George or.
Can I ask Cliff a question? Because I was puzzled by the points that you made, because over here we've been looking at the debate in America over Roe versus Wade and abortion, and these local referendums that have taken place, which seem to have had an effect on public opinion, but you didn't refer to it at all. So is it not really an issue of any consequence in the election?
Can I say that I don't know again? I probably can't do that. No, abortion is very important. When abortion's on the ballot, it wins, but it's typically on the ballot as an abortion measure, and it mobilizes people, from both sides of the aisle, especially women, to go out and vote, and it's won in a number of states, and it will win in a number of other states. What we don't understand is how abortion plays when you're looking at the executive on the ballot, whether that's going to have an influence, a positive influence. That's a huge question we still have. So you're not voting for an abortion measure, you're voting for Trump or Biden. Is abortion going to play into that? We don't know. That's an X factor. What we do know is that abortion plays into the anti-Trump vote. That's something I didn't talk about in so much detail. But between 25 and 30% of the American population is staunchly anti-Trump. And it doesn't matter, for instance, if Biden was 80 or 180 or 800, they're going to go to the polls and vote for him because they're voting against Biden. And abortion kind of is like linked or interspersed or interconnected with that anti-Trump feeling. So it's abortion, it's guns, it's sort of children in cages at the border. There are all these sorts of things that conjure up for the anti-Trump voter really a visceral reaction to him, and abortion is one of those specific points.
And anything else from what George was saying?
Yeah, the parallels between the UK and the US. I mean, as the polls suggest, we do like your accents. What I have learned over time is that there's many accents here. I mean, it's amazing. You don't all speak the same, nor do we in the United States of America. But no, I would look at systemic things, right? And so what I think is fascinating is that in the United States, we have an anti-establishment and establishment candidate, one running against the other. Okay, it's like 2.0, Trump-Biden. In the UK, you have two establishment parties going at it, right? However, in both countries, the levels of distrust of the system, now I'm talking about systemic distrust, not necessarily pessimism relative to the economy, but systemic mistrust, belief that the system is broken, are about at the same levels like the UK and the US, and indeed on some measures that we have at Ipsos, it's higher for the UK. And so my question is, how does that manifest itself here in the UK when you have two establishment parties? Is it going to be a question of the day after? Once the Conservative Party loses, is it going to be in shambles? And is that shambles going to be filled, that vacuum going to be filled by someone or something? I don't know. But I draw those more systemic sort of similarities.
I think what George was saying earlier about us being at a bit of a catalyst moment, not just in the UK, but around the world, is something we're also seeing in data that we track. We've tracked some of our big value statement pieces, things that don't tend to move, like generally who you are, how you feel about the world around you, etc. And we've been tracking them over decades, and some of those, given the volume of things that are impacting on people today, have started to move, people feeling a sense of overload in their day-to-day lives. And in those moments where people feel huge overload and things are starting to move, that's when populist sentiment tends to cut through best. And you can see from Cliff's first slide the proportion of the UK populists who are saying that they also think the system's broken, it's not working in their favour, etc., has risen, and that is and should be a concern for us. And then I think you had a point about AI. Well, so I have a slide. Some of you in the audience have been to some of the stuff I've spoken about before, have seen it. I know the two Ians have. It's one where you have Donald Trump cheating on his wife and Biden cheating on his wife. And it's a very simple AI image. It's one of the most disgusting slides I show in any of my decks. However, that's not the issue. The issue is going to be where it's proper on policy statements, and we're seeing some of that start to transmit and come through as well. And it may be something certainly more in the US, but drip feeding into the UK election as well. And I think it should be a concern for the political parties.
Well, I mean, given the background of Ukraine, that there's only one winner for disrupting the process of democracy in both the US and the UK. Both the polls at the same time, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, several geopolitical rivals who could win out of that.
I think that in the UK, sort of opinion has sort of crystallised. I think it was quite clear in 1982 that Neil Kinnock was not going to win. But people had made up their mind long before the Sheffield rally. For the younger people in this room, the Sheffield rally will be completely meaningless, but this was a huge rally that took place about 10 days before the election, where Neil Kinnock addressed the crowd as if he was Jurgen Klopp yesterday at Liverpool. But people had made up their mind long before that, and I think people had made up their mind here about Liz Truss, who was never actually elected. Boris Johnson had been elected, but I think these are the factors that determine where people are going. And the point that Cliff made about inflation, the rate of inflation is going down here, and it's going down in America. But it was very high, so therefore it is. If your groceries were £100 and they're now 110, there might be 100. It should be 125, but people don't give you any great credit for that. At a meeting I was at last week, there was a guy there who produces Jack Daniel's whiskey, and he said, "I produce a luxury product for people who buy gas. So if the gas price goes up, our sales go down." So so there is that calibration in terms of the cost of living, and that is one of the biggest sort of features here. But I think probably in this country people have made up their mind on a whole series of different factors, including the cost of living, and probably made up their mind, and it's not going to be changed by AI or a meme that shows Keir Starmer jumping out of an aeroplane or whatever.
Well, interestingly though, so for such a long time inflation was riding high here as the key issue that people were worried about, but public services like the NHS now have really stepped up and into the fore. They're worried about the economy more broadly, but public services is a big area, and that is an area where Labour are traditionally strong.
Yeah, brilliant. So I could just go with this for ages, but
I just want to make
should go to the audience in a minute. Cliff, you go. Yeah.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
He's come all the way from America.
Yeah, come on.
You are our star.
And I do offer a unique accent.
Yes, you
I
do.
Yeah. No, I was just make a comment about outcomes with the Trump victory. I agree. Biden would be more of the same. Ultimately, I think we have to think about the composition of Congress to really think about Trump. It looks like it's difficult to say at this point, but it looks like it might flip. The Senate goes Republican and the House goes Democrat. Just as the vagaries of America. But ultimately, that's good because it's divided government. So it's not so clear to me on the domestic side if he's able to unwind things that Biden put in place, because environmental agenda, et cetera. Maybe on the regulatory front, you can tweak things more quickly. There's some question about the central bank. Will he take autonomy away? He's talked about that, but it's much more difficult than just talking about it. Obviously, on the foreign policy side, that's where he's going to have the biggest impact. Though I don't think it's so clear whether he's just talking about Ukraine as a bargaining chip, that is to get a better deal with NATO, or actually he would take take our support away. That's obviously a huge question mark. But what I can say is, at best, American support for Ukraine is lukewarm at this point. And it's been declining over time, and the decline continues. And so whether it be Biden or Trump, there's a public opinion issue when it comes to Ukraine.
Really important point. Okay, so we will come to the audience now. Do raise your hands if you've got questions. I'll take a couple at a time at least. Do say who you are. And yeah, please.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Arthur. I'm a MA philosophy student here at King's. So I've got a question for Kelly. I was just wondering about the medium to long-term effects of Liz Truss on kind of British political culture and public opinion. Would you say that the British public identifies Truss with the conservative or Eurosceptic right of the Tory party in a way that's fundamentally impaired that faction's credibility? Or do you think she's been kind of identified with the Tory brand more generally? So, like, for example, if the Tories put up Suella Braverman as the candidate after the next election, would people have a sense of, okay, Braverman is like a Truss-like or Truss-adjacent candidate, and then be less inclined to trust her, as opposed to, say, like, I don't know, like if Damien Green was the next Prime Minister? Is public opinion kind of vis-a-vis the different kind of party factions that fine-grained, or is she kind of associated with the brand generally? Thanks.
Great. Thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, just behind. There's a guy. Yeah, well, either of those guys. Yeah.
My name's Steve Sparks. I'm a retired army officer. The question is principally for Lord Robertson. I spent most of the 1980s sitting in various muddy holes, waiting for a group of Soviet forces, Germany, to come across what was then the inner German border. Do you think that the threat of Russian aggression is now greater or lesser than it was in the 1980s?
Very good. I'll take one more since they're two quite specific ones. Yes, yeah.
Hello, my name's Vincenzo. I was just interested in the panel's views on where the middle voter might sit in the US or in the UK. Are there a group of persuadables, and how valuable are they?
Yeah. Awesome. Well, let's take those. Very good. Might come to you first, George, on that specific question or anything else.
Is Russia a greater threat? Yes, of course it is. But not in the same way as it was when you were sitting in northern Germany. If he succeeds in Ukraine, then I would be very worried if I lived in Moldova or Armenia or Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan, because that's likely to be the next area that he might use military action against them. But we're not going to be immune either. Apart from the fact that the grey zone is the way in which the Russians are already playing heavily at the moment. Cyber attacks, organised crime, targeted assassinations, election interference, sabotage. These are the areas now which they are becoming very and highly professional. And that is the way that they will undermine us. And by undermining Article 5 and the guarantees that are provided, then that's the danger to us. On top of that, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Ukrainian population, having seen what happened to the Ukrainians who were left in occupied Russian territory, would prefer to be refugees rather than live in Ukraine under the Russians. So the prospect of 40 million refugees coming from Ukraine to the rest of the continent is also something that we had better sort of look towards. So that the threat is there, and it's considerable. What we don't seem to have is a political strategy for getting into the mind of Vladimir Putin in order to get him and the close group around about him to think in the way that the Politburo did in 1989. The 15th of February 1989, Russia left Afghanistan. No face-saver, no off-ramp. They felt they weren't winning, they were losing people, they were losing money. They'd only lost 15,000 people in 9 years in Afghanistan, and they pulled out. The Politburo under Gorbachev pulled out. So we have got to try and make that happen inside Russia today. And I think it's possible that we can do it with resolution and with commitment.
George, do you want to go?
Yeah, so hi Arthur, thanks for your question. On Liz Truss, so there were a number of things that impacted on the deterioration of the Conservative brand. Partygate, big step down, and also Liz Truss, but then general erosion in trust and competency of government over a period of time. So she was one factor. I think the economic drop for the Conservatives was heavily linked to the interactions of Liz Truss in that period. And you can see that as it picked up again with Rishi Sunak, but then's continued to be quite challenging for them. In terms of a change candidate, that was on scenario one, I had change your leader. But actually, when you ask the public whether they want a change at the next election or a change of leader, I can tell you which one of those is the correct answer, and it's not changing the leader again. And then when you go beneath the top line candidates, which they may have more name recognition of, and you have a look at some of the other key members of the Conservative Party that they might recognise, actually, there's not a natural choice there for the Conservative Party. There are Keir Starmer outpolls all of the others in the Conservative Party at that top level by a substantive amount. So it's not I don't think it's going to be an easy fix. And is she associated? She's just associated with the Conservative Party more broadly, I would say.
I was interested in the question about the persuadables. Is that what we're calling them? I like that. I like
you could
that.
column on that.
Yeah, I like that, the persuadables. Cliff will obviously have a view on the US persuadables, but, you know, obviously it's very important for Labour to win back those 2019 Tory voters in those key areas that went to Boris Johnson last time, and they seem, if the locals are anything to go by, and I think they probably are, they're doing pretty well with that because they won in lots of areas that they really need to. And if you look, for example, at, you know, the area that's mapped on by some of the new mayoralties, the East Midlands, Yorkshire, these are seats that the Labour Party needs to get back. That's the sort of key, you know, target voters. The Labour Party's got an awful name for these people. They call them the hero voters. Have you heard this? So when they're doing the door knocking, they're looking for the hero voters to come back from 2019. Awful, but anyway, there we are. But I think what's also really interesting about that is the degree to which voters are, you know, gradually and then quite fast abandoning the traditional sort of class loyalties in geographical regions, more and more people becoming swing voters and turning that territory into territory that can swing backwards and forwards in a much more unpredictable way, and voters themselves becoming much more transactional in terms of, well, what are these parties actually offering me? Not where do my family loyalties lie, or how does my town vote? It's not like that anymore, you know. And so these disruptions have really changed the nature of who the persuadables are and where they live. But I think it probably is quite good news for Labour when you look at that most recent set of results from earlier in May, not least because they're doing well in these, you know, particular areas. The Conservative Party will try and tell you that because Harlow didn't quite go Labour, that you know, they're still in the game, but actually, you know, in the target seats, for example, that they won in '97, the Labour picture is very good.
Yeah, in the US, it's about getting the vote out. It's about mobilizing your base and convincing your base to vote either on election day or to vote before the election. You know, when it comes to persuadables, there's a very little thin slice that, you know, is a focus, but really probably won't swing things. You know, in certain states, there are issues, right? And so you take Michigan as an example. You have the issue of Gaza and a lot of Arab American, Palestinian Americans that live there. There was a protest vote during the primary. And so I think though we have single issue voters potentially, I think less so for abortion being a single issue, more so for Gaza. But for the most part, overall, it's about getting the vote out. It's not about convincing a Trump voter to vote for Biden.
Yeah, just if I can just chip in a bit, just because I've just finished writing a long read for the Sunday Times about how Generation X are actually the key to the next election.
Of course they are.
We are Generation X, the kind of middle-aged.
Yes,
Old and young are cancelling each other out. The middle ground is actually Generation X, because we are the key, and we are looking in all directions. We are very worried about public services, NHS. That is going to come to the fore in Labour's strategy, I'm sure, much more strongly as we go through, but we've also got big economic concerns and other things too. So Gen X are the answer to the middle ground and the next election. It was quite a difficult thing to pitch. They're not massively, Sunday Times not massively convinced that is the case, but look out for that.
Can I make one more point on that as well? So very interested in what Kelly said as well about sort of if the Labour vote's sort of going off a little tiny bit, they're not going back to the Tories, they're going off to the Greens or the Lib Dems, for example. Again, it's bad news for the Tories because there's so much evidence now of people being willing to vote tactically where they live to get the local Tory MP out. And again, you know, the complementary pattern on the map is extraordinary at this point.
Yeah, I have to say, I've been in lots of conversations where lots of the Labour strategists seem quite more concerned and pessimistic of it. It's quite as rosy as it seems. And the sort of the Ming Vase strategy, which they have, is very rigorous, and you can see why they have got that. But you do feel it's very much a push away from the Conservatives, not much of a pull to Labour as yet. And I do think they are going to have to up that if it's not going to be.
Well, we saw in Scotland you know, the traditional loyalties just disappear. People were voting identity politics, they were voting competence, and they're now making judgments that are not based again. And, you know, my father always voted Labour, so I vote Labour. Or like, you know, I was born a Tory, I will always be a Tory. You know, people make random choices and they are voting tactically as well. And that's, you know, now being transferred to the rest of the country.
Yeah, that's very true. So now we've got an option. It's a lovely evening, and we could have drinks and have more casual conversation, or I could take another round of questions. So I'm going to see who's going to put their hands up and stop people drinking. Oh, really? You stand by your beliefs. That's good. If you want to ask a question,
yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we've got two there. We'll take them super fast and super fast answers, and thanks.
Can I be cheeky and ask two questions?
If you're super fast.
Okay, would it be correct to frame the election as a cost of living election? This is for the US, I think, rather than the Trump trial election. And two, are the ongoing legal cases against Trump firming up his softer votes? For framing, but I hugely thank you all for the time. So.
That was great. Really well done and really concise. There's a guy behind you who was also going to be equally concise, I think.
Yes, sorry everyone. Thank you to all the speakers. Given there's two big points that I was kind of curious that weren't addressed in both elections. We've got the spoiler votes in the US, potentially around RFK, and Mr. Farage standing on the side of British politics. And I was just curious to get some thoughts on how they could play into this.
Yeah, that is a big one, isn't it?
Yeah,
we might get to that in drinks, but I'm going to give panel a chance to answer those questions and any final reflections. But you don't have to, because we can drink. So I'll come George, and then end with Cliff.
Yeah, well, populism is the name of the game, and you know, we talked in terms of Labour and Conservative. You know, occasionally Liberals in terms of tactical vote, but you've got Reform. You know, the renamed UKIP party there as well, and Nigel Farage has not yet really appeared fully in there. So these are spoilers, which are going to have some ultimate effect on the outcome of the election. And we shouldn't sort of forget that identity politics is not simply confined to Scotland. It is now, you know, quite a big factor influencing the way people vote in England as well. Very good.
Just on the persuadable point earlier, because it fits slightly in with your reform point, we still have around 50% of people who tell us they're undecided and they may change how they vote. That is a substantive wild card in the UK election, and it does draw your attention to the sort of softness of that Labour League that we touched on earlier, and how that will be impacted in the run-up to the election, what the key issue will be of the day when we come into looking at that, whether it will be the NHS, whether it will be the economy, whether the Conservatives will have rowed back and sorted out some aspects of the economy by then. So I think whilst a lot of pundits you know, are calling it, and I made a joke at the beginning about it being not as much of a cliffhanger, it's going to do cliffhanger as the US election. You know, there may still be bumps in the road ahead.
Good. Miranda, do you want?
Oh, I'm sorry. No.
Talk about Trump, please.
No,
Please
I was going to make a joke.
That's much more glamorous than what I was going to say.
No, you go.
Okay, all I was going to say was obviously, you know, Reform UK, if there was some sort of deal done between, you know, the Conservative strategists and Richard Tice, Nigel Farage, the two-headed, you know, horse that leads Reform UK, that would change things in quite a lot of seats, because you know, the Brexit Party standing down helped a lot of Conservative MPs hang on to their seats at the last election. So that would, you know, that would, you know, throw a googly. Is that the right? Terrible at sporting metaphor. Sorry. That would throw something or other into the race here. But you know, at the moment, that's so impossible to call, because much of it might depend on how much Ofcom interferes in GB News, and how Nigel Farage thinks his career is going as a TV presenter. So that's, again, you know, impossible to call that intervention.
Yeah, on the UK, I mean, like my reading of the data is that the primordials of populism are here. They're just not manifesting themselves clearly, I believe, because the system here is more integrated, right? You have two establishment parties. My question is, after the election, what happens to the Conservative Party? Does that become a vessel for something else? I think that's something to watch long term. When it comes to Trump, indictments didn't affect him. He kept on ticking. We believe that conviction in jail time, by the way, in the United States, you can be convicted and be in jail and still run, okay? And it's qualitatively different. I think everyone would agree. Our focus groups suggest that as well, but exactly how much that shaves off, we're not quite sure. A point, 3 points, we're not quite sure. We have to understand, once again, he represents a huge swath of America who believe in him, right? And to the last point, which is basically a third way, we've been talking a third way for generations, and there's never been a third way, and the point is why, because moderates don't vote like partisans do. They don't show up to polls. That said, between 15 and 20% of the American population don't like either choice. I don't know why, right? But either choice. And you put in a nondescript whomever, it's like 15%, 10, 15, 20%, depending on how you ask the question. RFK, is he serious? He is a candidate, will be a candidate. He represents something. He takes a little bit more away from Trump than from Biden. Third parties typically taper off over the course of the electoral cycle. Could he have an effect? Maybe, but I think that only becomes more clear the closer we get.
Brilliant, brilliant, and just allows us, that culture war link allows us a little plug on, because I do think that what happens after the election and how that plays out in the political debate about whether we do see real proper culture war framing coming to the UK with a more freed factions within the Conservative Party against the Labour government, if that comes to pass, that is struggling to make a material difference to people's lives. I think that is a key dynamic, and we'll keep doing that culture wars tracking, because I think it is the big dynamic over the next election, going into the next parliament, going into the next election. And just to say as well that the culture wars work that we're working on now with Ipsos is around climate change, because it really is coming to the fore, and lessons from the US about how climate's being worked into that political identity elements of things, which is going to be a key aspect for us. So that's it from us. We only went 2 or 3 minutes over. That's their fault. But it was a brilliant, really brilliant discussion. So it's just for me to say thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you to the brilliant teams at Policy Institute and Ipsos for putting this together. And finally, thank you to our amazing panel. And we can now go and have a drink.